Haha. What up? Peace, world. Just getting back to it. I always throw a little piece of tape shutting, you know what I'm saying, on top of my joint. I know I got the same shirt I had on yesterday, but I've been in the house most of the time outside paying some bills. So please excuse my attire. And when I'm at home, I'll be comfortable. I don't be trying to impress nobody. I got me a lady. I'm straight. You know what I'm talking about? But anyway, this is Rebels Against Slavery. Readers are leaders. You know what I mean? I'm continuing my mission. I'm actually feeling this little joint. This is giving me like inspiration to do different things. It gives me lots of thoughts. And I never really read for fun. I read to learn things. Now I really read for fun, but it's actually fun to still learn. So I'm gonna continue with chapter 2 in Rebels Against Slavery. And this is about the Maroons. The term Maroon is believed to be a derivative of the Spanish word cimarron, which refers to domestic animals that have escaped and gone wild. The word was first used in the Caribbean with a reference to runaways who organized themselves into communities that were located in hard to reach but easy to defend areas. One of the earliest Maroon societies in the New World was formed in 1663 when planters in Dutch and French Guiana, South America, sent their slaves into the forest to avoid paying taxes on them. After the tax assessors left, the slaves refused to return to their masters. They remained in the interior and set up their own nations. From their strongholds, they resisted being captured and conducted long-term guerrilla warfare against the colonial plantations. One of the strongest of these rebels was an African-born slave named Cujo, who claimed that he was of the Akan people of Ghana. In 1725, Cujo led a band of runaways into the Jamaican mountains, where they established their own state. After years of costly struggle, the British governor was forced to sign a treaty with Cujo in 1738. Cujo agreed to send back any runaway slaves in return for rights of self-government and a tax-free existence. It seems unreasonable that a man who fought so hard for his own freedom would send another person back into slavery. To help understand his decision, it is necessary to understand his culture. Cujo grew up in West Africa, where owning slaves was an accepted institution with long-standing customs and traditions. In Mali, for example, slaves could practice their own religion, communicate in their own language, marry a person from their own culture, or sometimes from the master's family. Some slaves could rise to positions of authority within their master's house, or even become valued counselors or advisors to him. At one time, if a slave was freed, it was not uncommon for him or her to become a slaveholder. There was no shame attached to being a slave. In fact, the shame was directed at the masters of runaways. Cujo's purpose in running away was not to end slavery as an institution, but to guarantee personal freedom for himself and his followers. That was where his loyalties were focused. Other groups were expected to fend for themselves and their own people. As fragmented as they were, the maroon populations of South America and the Caribbean were a constant drain on colonial resources. The Portuguese couldn't stop the holdouts of Brazil, nor could the Spanish in Cuba. In fact, Maroon resistance was so strong, several European powers signed treaties with Maroon rebels. The terms of these agreements were similar to those negotiated with Cujo. Each group was guaranteed its autonomy in exchange for cooperation and return of fugitive slaves. During the 17th century, slaves who came to the colonies from the islands brought with them the knowledge of how Maroon societies operated, and some of them helped form the first runaway communities in North America. Some of these first groups included white indentured servants and Native Americans as well as blacks. There are references to maroon communities being established in the mountains of North Carolina, Virginia, and in the swamps of Florida and Georgia. The Great Dismal Swamp, an area covering 30 by 15 miles along the Virginia and North Carolina border, was a favorite hideout for runaways. Life in a maroon camp was as harsh as the surroundings. Octave Johnson, a 21-year-old runaway, joined a band of Maroons outside New Orleans, where it was reported there were 300 fugitives living in the swamps. Johnson described his life among the Maroons to a Union Army officer during the Civil War. And this is what it stated. I had to steal my food, took turkeys, chickens, and pigs. Before I left, our number had increased to 30, of whom 10 were women. We were 4 miles behind the plantation house. Sometimes we would rope the beef cattle and drag them to our hiding place. We obtained matches from our friends on the plantation. We slept on logs and burned cypress leaves to make a smoke and keep away mosquitoes. Eugene Jardal, master of hounds, hunted for us for 3 months. Often those at work would betray those in the swamp for fear of being implicated in their escape. We furnished meat to our fellow servants in the field who would return cornmeal. As early as 1670, Virginia set out to destroy all known Maroon settlements before they posed a threat to plantation safety. To do this, they sought help from the Native Americans who lived in the area. Colonial slaveholders feared an alliance between Native American and black runaways and resented the adoption of blacks into their group. Early Carolina documents are filled with dread of an Afro-Indian collaboration, Gary B. Nash wrote in Red, White, and Black. By fashioning the harshest slave code of any of the colonies, by paying dearly for Indian support at critical moments, and by militarizing their society, white Carolinians were able to restrict the flow of blacks into the back country. The Cherokee Hill Country never became the equivalent of the Maroon hideaways in Jamaica or the Brazilian Columbos as a refuge for runaway slaves, as many as Carolinians feared. Maroon communities were never as successful as they might have been because colonists took measures to keep the blacks and Indians divided, first by using fear and arrogance, and then by playing one group against the other. Indians were encouraged to become slaveholders, which many of them did. The Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and Creek owned slaves, but much to the dissatisfaction of Southern planters, slavery was practiced more like a fairly managed sharecropping system. All treaties between the colonists and Native American groups contained a fugitive slave clause, and Indians were often used to track and lead colonists to Maroon villages. Conversely, in times of conflict, some blacks were given their freedom for fighting with whites in wars against Indians. According to Genovese, effective white manipulation of Indians and blacks against each other reduced possibilities for the organization of stable Maroon colonies. But in spite of these efforts, in the early 19th century, Southerners' worst fears were realized when Maroon activity shifted to Florida. The Seminoles and runaway blacks formed a major alliance by which its very existence was considered an outrage to Georgians. Spanish-controlled Florida had been a haven for runaway blacks for several decades. In 1750, a group of Creek Indians left Georgia because of tribal disputes and migrated to Florida too. Creeks began calling this group Seminoles, which in the Creek language means runaways. The two peoples of color prospered in peaceful, cooperative communities. Their relationship with each other was based on the integrity of the individual and mutual group respect. Blacks brought their knowledge of rice cultivation, and the Seminoles shared their land. The partnership yielded a prosperous economy because everybody had a vested interest in the success of their individual endeavors. The Seminoles adopted black men and women into their group, and marriages between blacks and Seminoles were commonplace. Before long, a black Seminole population developed. Colonial Georgia complained loudly about the runaway problem and blatantly disregarded Spanish borders by sending Georgia militia into Florida in search of runaways, but Seminole and black warriors repeatedly drove them back. After the Revolutionary War, there was a push to annex Florida, but public opinion was against the move, so the idea died from a lack of support. There was a fort located in the Apalachicola River. I don't know how you pronounce it. Apalachicola River in the Florida Panhandle, not 50 miles from Georgia. When the British withdrew after the War of 1812, it was handed over to a group of black Seminoles. Known as Fort Negro, it was commanded by a part black, part Seminole named Garcia. Described as a lean, tense-looking man, Garcia was respected for his courage as a warrior, but feared because of his cruelty to enemies. He was a strong leader and a perfect man to put in charge of defending the fort. On May 16, 1816, General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812, ordered General Edmund Pendleton Gaines, commander of the southern frontier, to blow up the fort, regardless of the ground on which it stands, and restore all stolen eagles to their rightful owners. In July 1816, United States Armed Forces, aided by 2 offshore Navy gunboats, stood outside Fort Negro. Garcia's men raised the British flags as a challenge. They were refusing to surrender. Garcia fired a cannon shot to emphasize his point. Both sides exchanged a number of cannonballs. Then one volley landed in the fort's ammunition storage area, and the place went up in flames and smoke. As the gunpowder exploded, over 200 people were killed and 64 wounded. Garcia was captured and executed. A few families fled into the swamps and hid in the tall grasses. Those who survived were sent back to slavery even though they had been born in Florida and had never been slaves. But it was all perfectly legal because according to slave laws, as a black person who did not have papers stating that he or she was free, could be captured and sold. In January 1818, Jackson, with two mounted regiments, captured Pensacola, and in 1819 the United States paid Spain $5 million for Florida to help soften Jackson's renegade actions. By 1821, without declaring war, Florida passed into the United States' hands. Whites were clamoring to move into Florida, but they demanded safety. Something had to be done about the Indians and the black runaways. Jackson was sympathetic to the slaveholders because he owned slaves himself, and in his opinion, Indians were savages who stood in the way of progress. The United States government decided that Native Americans had to live on a reservation in the south central part of the state. This swampy and inhospitable land, known as the Everglades, was very different from the northern Florida, where the Seminoles had raised crops and fruit. Yet, in 1823, Seminoles agreed to move to the reservation. A young Seminole leader whose name was Asiyaholo, or Black Drink Crier, watched in horror as his people were driven from their land and black friends and family were taken against their will. He spoke out against the treatment of his people. I don't even know where I was at. Somebody's calling me about something. My apologies. Of his people, both black and Indian. United States policy tried to undermine the strong friendship between blacks and Seminoles, but the council leaders would not condone slavery. To get around the government, they began buying members of their family and then freeing them. This further angered government agents. Some Seminole leaders argued that it was better to allow the whites to take the blacks than to jeopardize their families by trying to protect them. This argument didn't hold up because so many Seminoles were racially mixed. Who was black? Who was Indian? Asiyaholo was one who was against the re-enslavement of free blacks. By then, he was a vocal leader among the Seminoles, highly respected by his peers. When whites spoke his name, it sounded like Osceola, and that is how he became known. In 1829, Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States. His administration is remembered for being one of the harshest toward Native Americans. Old Hickory, as Jackson was nicknamed, wanted all Native American groups to move west of the Mississippi River. The Indian Removal Act put into law one of the most shameful events in American history, the forced resettlement of Native Americans to reservations often far removed from their traditional homelands. The Seminoles were one of the 5 Native American groups that were affected by the policy. Contrary to all prior treaties, the Seminoles were once again expected to leave their farms and this time move hundreds of miles away to Oklahoma Indian Territory. In June 1832, Osceola refused to agree to leave his lands and home. He was prepared to resist to the death. Some Seminoles left Florida and moved to Oklahoma, but those who refused to go rallied around Osceola. First, Osceola had a personal vendetta to settle. He killed Wiley Thompson, an Indian agent who had forced Osceola at gunpoint while being held in prison, to sign a treaty agreeing to leave Florida. In December 1835, Seminoles scored a victory when they defeated Major Francis Dade's entire relief force. President Jackson was furious. General Winfield Scott was given command of the army in Florida, but his tactics were no match for the hit-and-run guerrilla tactics of Osceola's men. Dissatisfied, Jackson replaced Scott with General Sidney Thomas Jessup, who was told to use any means necessary to defeat the Seminoles. Osceola's people were tired and hungry, constantly on a run. They had been unable to plant and harvest crops. Osceola was against the wall, but he refused to give in, especially regarding slavery. In May 1837, General Jessup sent a message to Osceola asking for a meeting. Weary and ill, Osceola agreed. More than 3,000 Seminoles of every size and hue showed up at Fort Brooke at Tampa Bay. Osceola spoke eloquently on behalf of his people. Jessup insisted that the Seminoles had to migrate to the west. When pinned to specifics, the Seminoles realized that they would be settled among their old Indian enemies. Slaveholders in Florida and Georgia insisted that blacks were their property and refused to permit them to leave with the Seminoles. Osceola leaped to his feet. These black people have lived with us for many years. They are friends and allies. We will not turn them over to the whites. The line had been drawn. Osceola and his people fought on. The order came from Washington: break the resistance. In October of 1837, Osceola agreed with a number of other leaders under the white flag of truce to meet with General Joseph Hernandez of the Florida militia near the city of St. Augustine. Suddenly, Osceola was seized by soldiers, beaten and tied up. The truce had been a trick to capture him and his men. Under heavy guard, Osceola was moved to Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. When word of how he had been captured spread among the American people, they were ashamed. Is this a country without honor? One editorial asked. Taking a person captive under a white flag was considered the highest form of cowardice. A free Osceola drive began, but it was too late. Osceola, weakened by the malaria and fatigue, died in January 1838. He was not yet 35. Back in Florida, the war was far from over. The Seminoles fought on. When Osceola had been taken under the white flag, so had one of his captains, a leader named Wildcat. While being held at Fort Marion, Wildcat and his men fasted to lose weight, then loosened the bars on the windows and slipped away in the middle of the night. Deep in the swamps, Wildcat called a meeting of the warriors who had fought with Osceola. Among them were two black Seminoles, Negro Abraham and John Horse, who pledged their allegiance to Wildcat. John Horse, considered a shrewd negotiator and skilled warrior, soon became second in command. Together, the two men led militant Seminole forces that refused to leave their homes. The Seminoles knew their land and loved it. Abundant with life, the swamps and marshes of the Everglades provided food and shelter for them. Living on the run, the Seminoles moved among the cypress trees with speed and agility. Many of the United States soldiers who came near weren't prepared for what they encountered in the Florida swamps: snakes, alligators, oppressive feet, and mosquitoes. By 1843, the climate and the inner struggle had taken its toll on both the soldiers and the Seminoles. Most of the Seminole Nation, including 500 blacks who were finally allowed to migrate with them, had reached Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Still here were holdouts who refused to leave. The U.S. government finally realized that the Seminole Wars were costly, too costly to continue. The government had spent millions of dollars and 1,500 soldiers had lost their lives. The death toll among the Seminoles and their black allies who were forced marched across the country was staggering. At last, the war ended in 1843 when troops were withdrawn. Yet the United States could not claim a victory. There were still Seminoles who would not migrate west. The black and Native American descendants of runaway slaves and defying Indians still live in Florida today. They are proud members of the Seminole Nation, the only Native Americans who never surrendered. The name Seminole became synonymous with bravery and unbeatable spirit. Peace.